Does the existence of suffering and injustice and evil, does that demonstrate that there is no God? I know many people, when they open the newspapers or turn on the television news and they see some terrible example of suffering, I mean, this week it's Aleppo, next week it's Somalia, next week after that will be somewhere else. Does the existence of suffering prove there is no God? Well, I want you to notice something. The moment that we look at some situation in the world and say that ought not to be allowed, that ought not be the case, that very ought that we smuggle into that value judgment is a problem if there is no God. When I look at the scenes coming out of Aleppo as I film this video, and I say that ought not to be allowed, I'm implying that there's a way the world ought to be, and this isn't it. Isn't that interesting? Because if we live in a godless universe where everything is just atoms and particles knocking together, well, there is no ought. There simply is. And that ought that we've used there, that value judgment, is entirely invalid. Now, that's certainly a philosophical approach to the question of suffering, but here's the interesting thing. The more I've reflected on this question over the years, the more I've come to appreciate that what most of us want when it comes to suffering and injustice are not words. We don't just want a clever answer, we want something done about suffering and injustice. And that's why as human beings, we get so excited about things like compassion, for instance, as a quality we admire in one another. But think about the word compassion for a moment. Have you ever noticed what it means, how it's put together? The word compassion is two Latin words, com, that means with, and passion, that means suffer. And compassion basically means to suffer alongside. And that's actually the difference between suffering and empathy. If I'm walking down the street and I see a homeless person sleeping in a shop doorway on a rainy, cold night, and I look at them and I go, homelessness is wrong. In fact, I turn to the other crowds on the street and I go, homelessness is wrong. And then I walk on by and I've done nothing. Or maybe I've been empathic, maybe I've made a political point, but I haven't been compassionate because I haven't done anything. Or perhaps you're a student walking across university campus. You see one student being racially abused by a gang of 6 bullies, and you call out to everyone else in the plaza, racism is wrong. Well, you haven't been compassionate, you haven't done anything. You've been a moralizer. How would you be compassionate? Well, the homeless person, despite the fact it wrecks your plans for the evening, you take that person out, you buy them a meal, you find them a bed for the night, maybe you even invite them back to sleep in your spare room in your flat because you can't find anything else. Now you've been compassionate because it's cost you. Or you see the student being racially abused, and you don't just call out racism is wrong, you run across, you wade in, you separate the bullies from the victim, even though you may get 7 kinds of hell kicked out of you, because there's more of them than there are of you. Now you've been compassionate because it has cost you. You have suffered alongside. Well, we recognize that in human beings, that to respond to suffering, you can't just use words, you have to do something. So what about God and suffering? Well, that raises the screaming question, doesn't it? What has God done about suffering? If God simply sat up there in heaven and went, yeah, suffering and injustice is wrong, but stayed in heaven and did nothing, he would not be compassionate. But that is not the God of the Bible. The God of the Bible steps into history in the person of Jesus Christ. He gets his feet dusty with the dirt of the world and his hands bloody with the nails of the world. Because Jesus goes to the cross and pays with his life and pays with his blood to deal once and for all with the problem of suffering and injustice and evil, especially the problem of evil and injustice in ourselves. That is where so much of the suffering and injustice in the world flows from. The God of the Bible has not just spoken about suffering and injustice, he has done something. That is a unique answer in the Christian faith. And if you are disturbed, like I am, by much that's going on in our world right now, rather than run away from God, I suggest you run to him. Because only in him and only in Jesus is there the beginning, and far more than a beginning, to the answer of the biggest problem that faces all of us as human beings. Suffering finds its ultimate answer.